Welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
All right, guys, I'm excited to have another conversation about a topic and sort of a hypothesis that has been banging around in my head. And sometimes when I get these ideas, I'm like, I need a good conversation partner. So I'm excited that Chris Kuehl is going to be talking to me today. Chris and I have been friends for a number of years. We worked together on a nonprofit board in Jerusalem. We worked together at Epifio. We've been connected in different ways, and I've always loved having conversations with Chris. So Chris, thanks for coming on this today.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, guys. So we're going to dive right in. I'm going to read sort of this thesis and get Chris's reaction. This is called The Number One Reason the Western World Went Woke. It's a lot of W's. The number one reason the Western world went woke. So obviously there's a lot to this topic. I wanted to dial into one specific aspect of it that's I just can't get out of my head. I want to get Chris's reaction to this. So it says, over the past few years, many of us have been totally mystified by positions that are growing in popularity that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. The list is long, but three quick examples include giving puberty blockers to children, the movement to defund the police, and the claims that not voicing your agreement with certain brand new ideologies is the same as committing physical violence. I don't want to talk about the arguments for or against these positions because so many of these conversations serve to hide the real root of the problem, and that root is really simple to understand. First, it's important to note that the root of the problem is not individual radicals. In every age, there are tiny minorities that have radical opinions, and that will never change. This is not why these ideologies are growing in their popularity with a larger segment of society. There are many smaller causes that all contribute to this change, but I want to put forth the single cause that I feel is most responsible for why these movements grow, and this thesis will also help predict what other ideologies will grow and spread in the future. Here's my take in 3 words. Premature institutional success. Premature institutional success happens when a movement funded and led by a group of institutions is growing in momentum, but achieves its original goals too quickly. What do the leaders of these institutions do? They only have 2 choices. Number 1, they can declare success and encourage the donors and supporters to move on to other, more worthy causes. Or 2, they can find smaller, adjacent causes to direct their ever-growing power toward in order to keep the movement going. Which one do you think they choose? Which one would you choose if you dedicated your life to a movement? A perfect example of this happened during the movement to legalize same-sex marriage. The issue resonated deeply, not only with those personally impacted by it, but with a much wider group of supporters. The result was that huge, well-funded organizations with talented activists emerged and prepared for a pitched, multi-decade, state-by-state series of legal and legislative battles. And then it happened almost overnight. Right as the movement was hitting its peak, financial and popular support, state after state legalized same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court issued a ruling, the Republican Party removed its opposition from its platform, and victory was achieved. So what do these institutions and activists do at the peak of their power? In order to survive, they must find new issues to funnel their finances and energy toward, and they found that issue in this little-known area called trans rights. This pattern is playing out over and over again. Because of social media, it's becoming far less expensive and much easier for activists, institutions, and individuals to get their message out and sway public opinion. So they keep achieving this problem of premature success, which forces them to focus on smaller and smaller issues. The need for LGBTQ+ institutions to find systemic examples of homo and transphobic incidents is far outstripping the supply. The need for anti-racist organizations to find examples of systemic racism is also outstripping the supply. These organizations need to find more victims, and most importantly, they need to identify more and bigger oppressors. If they can't find them, then they'll have to make them. Activists activate. They don't deactivate. And deactivation is often what is needed in the face of premature success. The first time I remember this happening was when the manager of a Starbucks, with outspoken leftist views, decided to call the cops on two black men who wouldn't buy a drink in order to stay at their table. The image of the police handcuffing two black men and escorting them out of the Starbucks was all that was needed for every anti-racist organization to declare the manager as a racist. I found this so confusing at the time because it seemed common sense to actually investigate whether this woman has a history of racism or whether it was just circumstantial that these men were black, and whether she would have done the same if they were white. But the supply of racism was at an all-time low. At the time, powerful organizations were on high alert to find examples of racism. They had been prematurely successful, and their very survival depended on increasing the supply. Since then, I could list hundreds of more recent examples of this, which is why I'm searching for the root, and I believe this is perhaps the most important element to understand. This same pattern plays out in every institution. In the government, the Department of Education cannot get behind educational endeavors that make them less significant. That's why effective decentralized educational strategies will be ignored and sometimes even opposed. That's how something called the Department of Education can actually oppose education. Institutional survival comes before the mission. This is easy for me to relate to because I've seen this play out in Christian institutions that I'm familiar with. A founder of one of these organizations once told me that he had achieved their original mission, but right as they crossed the finish line, they had more donors than ever lining up to support them. So they had to find another mission to keep going. This is perfectly understandable pattern, but its impact on culture when you have activist organizations with millions of dollars and nothing meaningful to do is tearing us apart. Let me end with one glimmer of hope. A Christian organization called the Wycliffe Bible Translators, which started in the 1940s. I'd once heard that they wrote into their original charter that once they had translated the Bible into every language in the world, they would shut down the organization. I love this idea. I can't find any evidence of this self-destruct clause online, but ever since hearing this, I wondered if there might be a way for a mission to have an organization rather than the other way around. Churchill once said, quote, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." I think the same can be said of activist institutions. All right. So, Chris, that's my thoughts. Now, I'm not saying, of course, this is the only cause, but I'm like, this is not one that I think is very well known. And it keeps, what I'm always trying to test with a thesis is does this keep predicting the pattern? Does this somehow like give us insight onto why this is happening so dramatically? And so this thesis is really stuck in my head. So give me your reaction.
Well, that's really good. First of all, I really like it. I wonder if what you're describing is more of a how though than a why. And here's kind of, I think you could talk for a very long time about what is going on at the bureaucratic and institutional level of America right now. And it's very, very hard to oppose this. It's almost kind of like cloak and daggered in some degree. It's these things are, it's hard to get at the root of these institutions and what's happening here. And so, when I hear you talk about this feels like, okay, wow, this feels like the institution is a delivery mechanism for a lot of what's happening right now. The way that I think you could really test what you're asking is, if you were to get rid of all the institutions, would we still be in the same place that we are right now? And not that you could necessarily do that, but just say hypothetically, if you could get rid of all, would we be in this place? So, and so here's what I want to kind of like present to you. Let me know what you think of this. It's another way of looking at this. And so, I would say, I feel like, we have lost our collective story as a country, as a nation, that we've kind of lost our myth, our origin myth, our meaning, like that we don't have a narrative that we're working off as a nation anymore. And I think that one of the reasons we have to kind of evaluate, and so when I was looking at this, I had to kind of revisit the idea of liberalism, as kind of the founding principle of our system, and so, the promise of liberalism was essentially that it would kind of remove these large metaphysical questions and create a more or less neutral moral framework for us to function off as a society. So we would, we could focus on trade, we could focus on growth, all these things that people have gone to war over and fought over for millennia. Let's just remove all of that, was essentially the idea of liberalism, and just let's live our individual lives. And the idea behind it was kind of neutrality. The idea, even with, everyone talks about the removal of church and state, which, it isn't in the Constitution, but it's a huge thing that people talk about. And I believe that this was kind of a disastrous idea. And without getting too far into the weeds on this, I think the big lie behind this was that you could create a truly neutral system. But anyone who knows anything about people knows that this isn't true. We all carry ideas and philosophies and things with us, right? So because we have removed religious ideas and beliefs from the acceptable competition of ideas in society by saying, hey, we can't include all those ideas, we're left with conversations around the worst of all possible ideas because they don't include like fundamental truths on reality. Right. And I would argue that wokeism, by definition, really is a religion. And what's even worse about where we're at in this kind of liberal era of the society that we're in is that tolerance is kind of one of the highest values, right? Tolerance and neutrality. So when you have something like wokeism that really is all about power, liberalism is basically left unable to defend itself by the virtue of its highest value, which is tolerance. So it's kind of like being overtaken, but it's saying, hey, we're not going to defend ourselves, or we're not going to oppose anything. We're not going to try to put any flags over any moral territory. So, I believe unless we have some kind of guiding framework that has boundaries, we're going to continue to face attacks like this. And I see institutions and things like this as major mechanisms of this stuff is all happening through. I mean, I totally agree. But I think that, outside of that, if we don't have some kind of absolute truth.
Yeah. Let me so an analogy kind of occurs to me about what we're talking about. So what you're talking about, I don't want to say like our two theses, if I could put them into one analogy, is what you just described is how the gate got open. So let's say you have a walled city, and so you're describing, look, there's not this overarching story that really causes us to cohere. And so the gate is now open for any number of ideas to come flooding in, because something's going to demand to be filled in that vacuum. Like we need some way, to feel like a moral person. So we need a story to tell us that I'm a good person. And so you have people that have no overarching story. So the gate is now open. I think my thesis is like, and the army outside the gate isn't just 2 or 3 people. It's enormous army. So it's like so the gate opened, and now we have this massive army because there's all of this activation. And so when you have this is a killer combination, to have both happening at the same time. So this is really helpful for me to hear. Like I agree that this is part of what's going on.
Family Teams is going to Israel. Join us on an 8-day tour of the Holy Land where Jeremy and April Pryor, along with an Israeli tour guide, will take you on the ultimate tour. Not only will you see all the major sites Israel has to offer, but you'll hear the history of the land from a native Israeli and from a Christian perspective. You'll experience the Shabbat of a lifetime, talk about God's multi-generational plan for Israel, and also what the land, people, and history teach us about God's vision for family. Learn more at familyteams.com.
And it's okay. So when you're talking about institutions, one of the things that I feel like I don't even know how to describe what we're talking about here in terms of like where we would position ourselves. Let's just say if we're people that are focused on the eternal kingdom, I don't want to put labels on us in terms of politics, and I want to try to stay out of that as much as I can. But one of the things that I think we've been really bad at understanding is how culture influences everything else. And so they often say that politics is downstream from culture. That what we see starting in our music and our movies and like where we're going, like whether you want to call it TikTok and all the delivery mechanisms for that, and that becomes, how do you kind of deal with that aspect of where we are? Because you have the institutional thing that's happening, but you also have the cultural decay that's happening. And so, it seems like, it's funny in some ways, the moral majority gets made fun of so much, of kind of being this, Puritan group that was, but if anything, they undersold what the next 30 years would look like. It's like, it's, if we had thought that in the late 90s, we'd be discussing, puberty blockers on children and the sexualization of children the way we are. I mean, it's just crazy. If we never thought we'd be discussing partial birth abortion. I mean, all these things that have kind of, and what I'm saying is that unless we have, I don't know what level this happens, leadership, institutions, relevant churches that are getting into this, discussion that are actually saying, hey, we're not going to cede this ground anymore. Like we're just going to stop believing that we're in this neutral system. What you guys are, what you're doing is not neutral. Why are we pretending that this is neutral? And we're so afraid to be called, oh, you're just you're just this or you're that or whatever. And it's like, they have the high ground in that conversation right now. I don't think like morally, but definitely culturally, where the cultural elite and the cultural hegemony is right now is all at that level. So, I mean, it's hard. It takes a lot to, but no one is willing to like stake a claim in moral ground anymore. And I think as soon as you do that, the atrophy that happens, I mean, it's like everything. I mean, if you don't take care of your marriage, if you don't take care of your lawn, if you don't take care of your body, you have to kind of be proactive with these things. Otherwise it just atrophies.
Right. Well, I think part of what I'm wrestling with a lot is that, if you step out of, like you're describing, there's this fear, there's the cultural high ground. And this is what I've been really confused. Why isn't there more, why isn't there more symmetrical battle between two different opposing ideas? Why has culture become so successfully just one-sided? Yeah, I mean, there's certainly other parts of the culture where there is more symmetry, but I would say in the culture creating world, that symmetry has really broken down in dramatic ways, and and this is part of what I'm trying to process, like, how did this happen? And I think that the, like, and one of the pictures that comes to mind is when you think about like a lot of people that are church going Christians, they're pouring their money, huge amounts of generosity. And there's been a lot of, relatively speaking across the world, if you look at how people give, people, sort of church attending Christians give an enormous amount of money to charitable giving. And that is typically in the form of money to their churches. And, those churches have these small expressions and they, have pastors, and they're fairly expensive, sort of institutions and infrastructures they have to create. So there's a real traditional historical funding of those institutions. But now you have on the other side of the ideological lines, really well-funded institutions, people really want to do good in the world. But part of what they think that what that looks like is, just dumping money into these institutions that really they don't have the supply of issues that they wish they had. And so they just tend to just really overfund and overreact to a lot of situations because they're primed and ready. And if they can find just one example of what they're describing and vastly publicize it, the amount of then activation, funds, interest, just come pouring in back into the organization. It's a perfect cycle of getting people more and more alarmed and more focused. And then you add to that what you were describing, which is this sort of the power they have over sort of the culture creating elements of what's happening, and this cycle can get really, really intense very quickly.
Yeah, well, I wonder, dude, I just wonder to some degree, I feel like the church has never really understood culture. And I feel like they've always been kind of confused by it. Their giving goes primarily into like very, very vanilla versions of like the church and missions. And these are all great things, like, but, I mean, what if like we had guys like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk that were more like in the Christian space, who were funding like films and books and cultural things that were like, I don't know. I feel like if we took like the salt and light in our culture more seriously, I wonder like if we actually started investing into cultural infrastructure here, and I think we're so far behind the eight ball on this. Like, I'm kind of like, I don't even know what that looks like, but I think what you're saying is, it makes a really good point. I don't know. Do you follow any of the intellectual dark web guys like Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein and some of these guys? It's interesting, like who's kind of partnered against like wokeism right now. And Elon Musk, these guys, there's a much broader, almost collective than you would think. Because they've all been more or less like come for in the age of wokeism, and while I agree with a lot of them, their whole thing is they just kind of want like the liberalism of the 90s. if liberalism is like a software update, they want to revert back like a few updates, like let's like, you know,
your
this
father's
became
ACLU, you know, when they actually care about liberty. Yeah.
That's right. You know, and so their kind of sense is wokeism is just liberalism that's gone, you know, too Puritan. But they have no answers. To me, it's like, okay, well, of course, liberalism, this was always going to be where we would end up, because we are not in a neutral, there's no, like, the idea of like neutrality is a total myth, in my opinion, you know? And for me, it's more like, how do you redefine a Christian society? I think liberalism is a great second layer. But I don't think it can be a first layer. Like I like, otherwise I don't know how you get out of this position if it is.
So this is like why liberalism failed. Is that kind of like you can't actually build a stable society on those principles? Eventually you're going to have this breakdown that's inevitable because the story itself doesn't cohere.
Yes, exactly. That would be my hypothesis right now. And I'm not like trying to like force salvations on people or any of that kind of stuff, you know, but I think that like if we don't have some just like very basic foundational principles about life, about reality, about truth, about all these things, this is where we will, I mean, it was,
well, I hear what you're saying. I would, if I could describe, you know, as you guys are listening to this, so it seems like, Chris, you're saying, look, there's a foundational layer, a foundational story that could provide the common ground on which we can have all kinds of ideological disagreements and conversations. But when that bedrock breaks down, then you got a much more serious problem. And it seems like in the Christian story, where you have, you know, everyone's made in the image of God, human life is absolutely sacred. The story itself climaxes in the highest, you know, status, Messiah dying for his enemies. I mean, this really, to have that as the basis really makes inexcusable the denigration of other humans. Even though, of course, that's been done many times in the history of the church. It's always been against the founding story of what we believe in the way of Jesus. So you have that potentially as a layer, and it seems like that provided a fair amount of peace and began to allow for there to be some serious ideological disagreements in a society without it resorting, you know, sort of devolving into violence and just endless power struggles. And now that is fractured, you know, and so this thesis that no, that was always Enlightenment liberalism that gave us that bedrock. People are now poking holes in that idea because it doesn't seem like that actually does stand the test of time, and that eventually other stories are going to erode that because there's something foundationally sort of flawed in that being the base layer. That's kind of what I hear you're saying.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, like the guys like Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein, and, you know, I think Jordan Peterson is on his own, I would call it a much deeper spiritual journey than the rest of them. I think maybe 5 years ago he would have been more classically liberal in this way. They're basically just saying, hey, if we could go back to objective things, if we could go back to reality, if we could just get all of our definitions the same together, then we wouldn't have this problem. And I think that's not true. I think they don't understand things about truth, about like how power works, about, you know, they're not answering major metaphysical questions that we have as people. And so I think that we're always going to end up where we are right now. And I think that's one of the problems with kind of where that intellectual dark web is right now. And that's, you know, they don't really have answers for where we're at. So, you know, I don't know, that's and this sounds scary. This sounds scary to people because it's like, oh, you're gonna, you know, what do you want to like introduce like an Old Testament law into society? And it's like, no, not at all. Like I'm not. The idea of controlling anyone is so appalling to me. But I think that if we don't have like benchmarks in society, like guidestones that just like, hey, we're not even going to debate giving puberty blockers to children. That's like a no. I mean, as soon as you've entered into a debate, I think you've already lost. Like the fact that you have to even be, you know, in a place where you're trying to defend this kind of stuff, it's only a matter of time at that point until you kind of get swept away into where that's going. And so, like from your standpoint at an institutional level, like what do you think the hope is then? Like where, like how do we find our way out of this from like what you're talking about?
Well, I also compare kind of our two theses on this topic. I think you're talking about really a fundamental breakdown in the world of ideas, you know, that actually undergirds society. And most people don't even understand that layer unless you get kind of theological, philosophical But I agree that is, I mean, that is what undergirds any society, are those shared metaphysical convictions. And when those start to get questioned and destroyed, like, philosophers like Nietzsche are like, oh, this is going to be an absolute disaster. Even though he agreed with the basic deconstruction, he didn't have any illusion that it was going to create chaos. But I would say that what I'm really kind of arguing for is at the popular level, because there still is, I would say, for a little bit longer, a basic Christian presuppositions about the nature of, for example, every person being sacred. I mean, that's an idea that is constantly being attacked at the edges of society with the young and the old, but I think is a conviction at the heart of even, a very staunch atheist like a Sam Harris, who will fight to the death for what he thinks is, the sacredness of human life. Although I don't believe he has a strong philosophical argument for why he believes that. He thinks he does, but I don't believe he does. But I think that that layer still exists. It's being eroded. But I would say at the popular cultural level, where most people live and where most people are vastly influenced by these cultural movements, and that's becoming more of a thing. Like the amount of content we're all consuming on social media, the amount of content we're all consuming on streaming services, the amount of culture creating that's happening, the funds that are flowing into these institutions that don't have really clear missions any longer, really obvious places to do good in the world, policies that they really hope will change society at a radical level. They're really attacking smaller and smaller problems. And to do that with more and more funds, smaller and smaller problems, that's a really weird situation to be in. And I think we're just not alert to it. Like, what do you do when an organization that has a very, very small mission has hundreds of millions of dollars to shape culture in a social media age? Like, that is a disaster of massive proportions that I don't think we're prepared for or really even understand.
Totally. And I mean, I feel like we're not even talking about, at the bureaucratic levels of real justice and education institutions and prisons and, all the things that are, out, like our government, everything's been hijacked at this point, and so I feel like, and I totally agree with what you're saying. I listened to your podcast the other day, which I would definitely recommend everyone to check out, the one on like hijacked compassion, essentially. If we call it unchecked compassion.
Right.
And so you have all of these people that really feel like, like this is where their meaning is. And this is like, I'll give my entire life into this. It's just totally not checked by any other value system. Right. And so the energy that you can put behind that is basically eternal, because you're kind of hijacking like a God-built thing, I think, in all people,
well, I would say this too, Chris, and this is maybe a conversation for a later date. I think that these organizations, the ones you just described that really hijack compassion, are actually operating on a Christian, a Christian substructure. They don't really, they would never acknowledge it. But the idea that the victim is actually, I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher Rene Girard, but he goes deep into this, that our society has become totally enamored by the idea of the victim, which is a very, very strange philosophical idea that you only find basically in Christianity, and that was popularized. But you take all the metaphysics away and you're left with its basic underlying sort of convictions without the story of, for example, redemption. Like, how do you, part of the victim narrative is not to destroy the victim, or to destroy the oppressor. It's to, it's to redeem the oppressor.
Redeem both of them.
That's right. So anyway, so
that's
I'm
so
excited
interesting.
to have Go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to have that conversation. I have a couple thoughts on, if like kind of what I was talking about, where I think it goes from here, if you're interested in hearing.
Yes.
Those, I don't know how much time we have left, but if I can do it quickly.
Give me the high level overview where you're headed, kind of your thinking from there, and then
I'd love to talk. I think a couple of things can happen. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of a preference cascade, where something eventually becomes uncool, more or less. And so preference cascades typically happen within the cultural elite, or like kind of the cultural hegemony at that, and so you could really see Peter Thiel, David Chappelle, Elon Musk are definitely like characters or part of that cultural elite. And essentially something just becomes uncool, and so like it becomes like you don't want to do it any longer. And so like Thomas Paine with Common Sense, when he wrote Common Sense, like everyone was like, we don't want to be under the British, but no one was brave enough to say it. And he wrote that, and then it just like activated an entire community against the British, A recent one was, I don't want to get political on this, but masks on airplane. It was like I was on a plane the day after they took the mask thing up.
Yeah.
And 95% of people weren't wearing masks. You would have never saw that, but as soon as that like spell broke, it was like they were done. So, in like a cultural way that this happened was the Top Gun Toy Story thing that happened this year. The Top Gun just crushed it, and then Toy Story no one wanted. So it is starting to play out that like, maybe we're starting to realize the emperor doesn't have to have clothes. And so I'm wondering, I have some hope in that we kind of come back to I don't want to undersell humanity, right? We've been through a lot of things. Like, it's like,
that's right. Don't give up on us yet.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I would love to. That's really interesting. I would love to, because that does give me hope. I have seen that sudden movement. I don't think I have a good framework for how that could happen so suddenly. And I really think that idea of a preference cascade is fascinating. So yeah, shoot me any thoughts or whatever you're writing or thinking through, and let's have another conversation. I'd love to talk more about that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
All right. See you, dude.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.